laying some groundwork for how did we get to a point where this idea that a musician should display intimate moments of their daily life to their audience day in and day out, month after month, year after year. How did that come to be something that made some kind of sense as a way to have a job, right? If you'd been in 1910 and you'd said, hey, musician, you need to connect with your audience every day and tell them what you had for breakfast if you want to get a gig, they would have said, what are you talking about? And they would have been, right in doing that. So how did we get to that point? Then I want to talk about 3 individuals that I think display the spectrum of approaches or stances toward this kind of work. And then I'll lay out what I think are the 3 critical tensions for these people in managing it. And in saying these are the 3, I do want to refer back to Baxter and Montgomery's point that, in fact, the tensions are potentially infinite, that these are the 3 primary ones that emerge in the study. Does not mean they are the only 3, it means that these are the 3 that were most salient at this time for these people. So if we think about how do we get to a point where music seems to be something you should sell by telling people intimate things about your daily life or giving them pictures from your daily life, there are 4 different historical trajectories that come together. The first is the fact that music, from its very, very beginnings, has always been a social practice. What we have here, does anybody know what this is? I always like to ask because I didn't know about it until a few years ago, and it blows my mind. This is the oldest musical instrument ever found. It's a flute that's carved out of a bird bone from the rib cage. It was sawed in half lengthwise to hollow it out. The holes were carved in it. They're beveled so that the finger fits quite nicely in it. There was a mouthpiece that was glued on separately. All that sounds pretty high tech. Anybody want to guess when this was made? 40,000 years before Christ is when this is dated to. Money came around about 10,000 years before Christ is when we forget the first sort of monetary exchanges. So we're talking about some really early technology. This comes long after arrowheads and rocks, but it doesn't come after most things. It's one of the very first technologies that people created was a flute. So what does that tell us, right? One thing it tells us is we don't make music in order to make money. That's not the motivation for making music, and it's not the motivation for listening to it. So what is music then? And a number of theorists and ethnomusicologists in particular have talked about music as a basic form of human communication. Christopher Small, who's written a legendary and wonderful, wonderful book called Music King, describes it as an important component of our understanding of ourselves and of our relationship with other people. And in fact, he argues that the way that notes are arranged and that instruments play off of one another idealizes relationships and gives it, as we listen to the way the notes play off one another, we imagine idealized relationships, and we're able to sort of understand the act of relating to others in a way that language does not give us. Torino talks about music fulfilling different needs and ways of being human than language does. One of the artists with whom I spoke, Nacho Vegas, a Spaniard, describes it this way: when you talk to a friend, you think in a logical way, but there is another way of communicating to people, a way that has nothing to do with logic, with your reason. These are the confusing things that you have to put in songs. Right? So music becomes a way for us to understand one another and ourselves in ways that language doesn't afford. The most powerful articulation of this is a recent book by Gary Tomlinson, which miraculously manages to undersell itself with the title "A Million Years of Music, the Emergence of Human Modernity." That's only some of what he talks about. And he stops 50,000 years ago. He stops actually about the time of that flute. And he says early social structures, and he's talking here about things like the tribe, the leader and the followers, whatever kinds of proto-religious practices there were when those people were using those flutes and even before, they did not simply foster the use of music or attach themselves to it willy-nilly. It's closer to the truth to say that musicking created institutions. This term musicking is used because we've gotten to a point where we imagine music to be some kind of object that we buy rather than a practice in which we engage. So the term musicking is meant to invoke that this is a practice we engage in with one another rather than a disembodied object that's out there in the world with some sort of independent life of its own. And Tomlinson actually argues, I think very persuasively, that music is part of what made us evolve into humans, that working side by side in what he calls a common taskscape and breaking things apart, we notice that if we both were doing this in syncopation with one another, the job was a little easier and a little more fun, and we learned to be in rhythm with one another. And in learning to be in rhythm with one another, we evolved into being social beings. So he actually places our sociality at the feet of music and says music is not the only thing, but is an important part of what allowed us to become human. And our sociality is not prior to music, but is in part a consequence of music. Brian Travers, the saxophone player for the band UB40, talks about music as a way of catching people and touching them, and it's not easy. He says, anybody who thinks that easy, he's crazy. You can't substitute it with industrialism, with manufacturing bits of plastic. And this is in keeping with a lot of the artists that I spoke to. Travers is notable because his band had a huge hit single. They've sold more than 70 million records. They're still touring the world and playing to stadiums. He's done very, very well. Yet he still views his practice as a means of conversation, of interacting with other people, rather than a kind of sales of a product to others. So there's your first premise. That's your first historical trajectory, is music's always been social. This is not a new innovation. In a way, we're reclaiming music for what it has always been, if we're saying the person playing the music and the audience should be in relationship with one another. However, what happened historically, beginning arguably in the 11th century, although the history has not been written, and I wish it had been. I've had some music librarians hunting, and it doesn't seem to actually exist. But at some point, the historical division happens where some people become musicians, and other people, by definition, then become audiences. So instead of there being a participatory event in which the drums get passed around, or you play drums and I tap my foot and Annette sings and you hum and somebody whistles and that all together, we're all making the music. Instead, somebody becomes the music and the musician, and other people become the audience for that. And this takes several centuries to get to what we now take for granted. The musicians are people who stand on stage and they get the attention, and we pay to see that performance, or we pay to hear the song. And it's a career to aspire to, rather than just part of everyday life. And what kind of a career is that to which one might aspire? It's got a lot in common with a lot of other qualities of contemporary work. So again, if we think back to this concept of the gig economy, what is it about music that makes its work of gigging seem like a really good metaphor, a metaphor so good that we don't even realize it's a metaphor anymore, for thinking about contemporary work? And I would argue that it shares these four qualities that have been talked about a lot in thinking about works, particularly since the 1970s and the dreaded term neoliberalism. One of which is that musical work is immaterial. And again, we go back to musicking. Although there may be a recording, the music itself is always a performance, is always a thing that cannot be captured. And indeed, part of the reason that the music industry has struggled so much in the last 15, 16, 17 years since the advent of Napster is that music had been put in material form and industries had been built on this presumption that it was a material. So you bought the record, you bought the CD. And when we don't need that anymore, the materiality seems to disappear. Of course, it's still bits and bytes and needs power and all of that in order to work. So it's not truly immaterial, but we now experience it again as immaterial, much like knowledge work and so on. Musical work is also affective in the sense that it is meant to arouse emotion. It is about emotion. If you hear a piece of music and your feelings don't change at all in response to it, it didn't really work. That's its job, is to shape feeling. And music is also work that exhibits what Lisa Adkins, the labor sociologist, calls cultural feminization, which is to say, it's about managing others' feelings, but it's also about aesthetics. It's about how you look, it's about being observed, it's about existing to serve others, something that comes through in the service economy much more broadly. It's also precarious, right? People say, oh, you can't make a living in music anymore. Hardly anybody ever made a living in music. And most people who did only did so for a little while. It's very hard to get that next gig and to know that you can continue to make a career in this. You're always very close to never being able to do it for a living and having to find something else to do, which becomes a particular problem if, like many of the people I talked to, you're now in your 50s or your 60s, and it's kind of late to go become a lawyer, but you don't really know what else to do, and you don't really know how you can make a living anymore. And music has always been very tied to technology and to technological change. And again, I go back to that flute, right? From the earliest records we have of human art, but also of human cultural practice, speak to technologies of music making. The historian James Kraft has done a study of what happened when sound recording happened, what happened to musicians. It's a very close and detailed, wonky study of the American Federation of Musicians, the Musicians Union, from the period 1890 to 1950, during which recording was created. And what he finds is that to the extent that the musician's experience is representative, it bodes ill for workers in our own age of rapid and technological and institutional innovation. It suggests that the benefits of new technology will be distributed unevenly and more or less according to power relationships between the major groups affected by technology. What happened to musicians in this time period is that it used to be that every town had its own little local orchestra. Maybe they played at the movie theater to give soundtracks to the silent movies. Stores hired musicians to play music so that the shoppers could listen to. Workplaces hired musicians to make music to work to. As soon as recording came along, boom, nobody needed them anymore, right? Half the musicians in the United States lost their jobs within a very short time when movies with sound came along, because no movie theaters needed musicians anymore. I think that's important because people talk about the current crisis in music making as though it were the first time musicians had ever been disrupted by technology, and in fact, quite the contrary. In 1940, the American musicians went on strike and refused to record, saying we will not be forced to play at our own funeral, right? So this very thing that now the musicians cling to as their only hope for making a living was seen as a tremendous threat to making a living only 75 years ago. So